Okay, so welcome everybody, and good evening. Welcome to our New Hampshire Audubon Red Barn Speaker Series. My name is Christian Robinson, and I'm the naturalist at the New Hampshire Audubon Newfound Center. I'm excited to have the opportunity to bring this event to you, given the challenging times we are in. Thank you for signing up and taking the time out of your night to learn more about the state of our New Hampshire birds. I want to thank our members, volunteers, and supporters for your continued support in our mission to connect people with nature, researching and conserving species in peril, managing 10,000 acres of wildlife sanctuaries throughout the state for habitat and recreation, and advocating for sound environmental policy in the New Hampshire legislature. I would also like to thank our generous sponsor for the 5th year in a row, Christopher Locks and Morgan Stanley Wealth Management. Chris is a member of our Paradise Point Committee in Hebron, and we appreciate his support of the Red Barn series. Tonight we have Dr. Pamela Hunt, who is an ornithologist from the New Hampshire Audubon. Pam Hunt has been interested in birds since the tender age of 12, when an uncle took her to Brigantine National Wildlife Refuge in New Jersey. She went on to earn a bachelor's in science in biology from Cornell University, a master's in zoology from the University of Montana, and a PhD from Dartmouth College in 1995. Pam came to the New Hampshire Audubon in the year 2000, after spending 5 years as an adjunct faculty at Colby Sawyer College in New London. In her current position as avian conservation biologist, she works closely with the New Hampshire Fish and Game to coordinate and prioritize bird research and monitoring in the state, and also authored New Hampshire's State of the Birds report. Specific areas of interest include habitat use by early successional birds, particularly the whippoorwills, conservation of aerial insectivores, as in swifts and swallows, and the effects of events outside the breeding seasons on long-distance migrants. Pam also coordinated the New Hampshire Dragonfly Survey, a 5-year project that mapped distributions of these insects throughout the state, and remains active in the dragonfly field. So I want to give a warm welcome and a thank you to Dr. Pam Hunt, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Christian. Looks like those folks are still having trouble hearing anything. I'm not sure how to deal with that. But so thanks everybody. Hopefully this is going to work. This is my very first time doing a talk via Zoom. It's not Christian's first rodeo, so it went well last week. If folks are having trouble, try talking with him. Sometimes you can actually call into a Zoom as well and get the audio separately from the computer. That might be another option. So if you can't hear, you didn't hear that. So that was kind of pointless. All right, so I am going to share my screen and get this show on the road. Boom. Okay, so that's the end of the slideshow. How about I go back to the beginning? Okay, everybody get any questions? Okay, so I keep getting interruptions with the admit thing. Can you do the admissions too, Christian? I get the notifications for them now. Okay,
I'll just ignore them.
Okay, so yes, welcome everybody. This is a talk that has recently been updated as of March, and it's a work in progress. And yeah, hopefully this will answer a bunch of your questions about what's going on with our bird populations and how they're doing, good and bad. I usually give this talk. I have a lot of audience participation. That's not going to be very feasible here. So it's actually going to take less time to go through this, which hopefully will leave us more time at the end for questions. Okay. Why isn't it going forward? There we go. So the first question I usually ask people is how many species of birds occur in New Hampshire? And the short answer for that is if you really try really hard in a year, you can probably see around 300 species of birds. Only about 180 of those actually breed here. This report is going to focus on those, but there's another 100 plus or minus that you can see in migration with some regularity or that spend the winter here. And the whole point of this study that I'm going to report on, and the report that came out of it, is that we all have heard stories about bird population declines. Last fall, the big article that came out and got a lot of press about bird population declines. You know, those of us who work in bird conservation, that was not new news, but it certainly galvanized interest and so forth. So our whole goal here is to zoom that in and see what's going on here in New Hampshire. And if you're not aware, this picture is actually our state bird. We'll talk more about that in a bit, purple finch. So as I said, people have been watching bird populations for quite a while. You know, this slide here shows an article from Audubon's magazine way back in 2005 when we were talking about this. New Hampshire Fish and Game and its partners, including Audubon, have done the Wildlife Action Plan, the first one, again in 2005, which is all about, you know, what are the species and habitats at risk in the state and what can we do for them. The federal government, often in partnership with folks in Canada and Mexico in some cases, have done State of the Birds report. Massachusetts did a State of the Birds report, and so forth. And so with all this behind us, in 2009, New Hampshire Audubon put out our own State of the Birds report. And this was a document called the Conservation Guide, seen there on the left, which what I'm talking about tonight is based on. We've been updating that for the last couple of years, and the new version that will hopefully come out later this summer or in the fall. Things have been a little delayed because of things like COVID. And also, 4 or 5 years ago now, the state revised the Wildlife Action Plan. So the information we're going to see here is a compilation of some of the stuff I did for the State of the Birds, things from the Wildlife Action Plan, with updated information, you know, basically through the end of last year. Oh, come on, go forward. There we go. That first report and the current one is basically a summary of population trends and the threats that birds face, usually based on habitat. You can't look at every single bird independently and make a short presentation or short report, so we tend to lump them by habitat associations. But the first step was to collect all the data we have on populations. And some of you may be aware of something called the Breeding Bird Survey. These little black squiggles are Breeding Bird Survey routes in the state. There's 25 of them, 23 of them. And they've been going on since 1966. Once a year, someone covers that route and does a whole bunch of surveys, and those data get put into one big database that allows us to look at population trends for most of our common birds. Those are supplemented by things like the Christmas bird count, state waterfowl surveys, and surveys that Fish and Game and Audubon and other folks do for the less common things like loons and eagles and peregrine falcons. A lot of the birds we mentioned here are going to be getting data from those surveys. So we take all these data, pile them together, and that'll give us a better idea of what's going on with birds. And you do that, and you get this little, anybody remembers Pictionary? Not Pictionary, sorry, Trivial Pursuit. This is the breakdown into 6 categories of how, you know, the trends for the breeding species are in New Hampshire in the first 50 years, essentially. This is 2017 back to 1966 or so. The green wedges are increasing species, so roughly 1/3 of our species are increasing. Slightly less than half in the red shades are decreasing. A nice chunk are stable, and there's a small chunk that we just don't know. These are like marsh birds and nocturnal birds that are, you know, just hard to survey. So we're close to 50-50 between birds that are doing okay, increasing and stable, and birds that are doing poorly, decreasing with a few unknown ones. Sometimes my thing does not move forward for some reason. Whatever. Just a little, you know, we compared the trends from the 2009 report to 19. You can see most of these are pretty similar. The big differences are the number of species that were uncertain or unknown has gone down. We've collected a lot more data in 10 years that help us get that sorted out. So we put all these species in habitats. I'm not going to go into super detail on what those habitats are. We'll see a version of that shortly, but there's 9 of them based on what was in the Wildlife Action Plan. And also the threats to those habitats are also based on the Wildlife Action Plan. and include things like, in this case, salt marsh ditching. This, the lower right picture is shoreline development. All of these are things that people are probably familiar with that will impact habitats and thus the birds that use those habitats. So if we look at these habitats, these 9 habitats, we'll go through each of these in a little more detail in a second, and combine those trend categories into 3 to make it easier to see. So red is bad, meaning decreasing. Green is good, increasing or stable. And the yellow is we just don't know. And that color scheme will continue on through the rest of this talk. So just think red is good, red is bad, green is good. And you can see right here that some habitats have a whole lot more green than red, and some have a whole lot more red than green. And the next bunch of slides, in fact, the core of this talk is going to be talking about how exactly what's going on in those different habitats and species and why they might be declining or increasing and so forth. So with no further ado, we'll start. The first habitat here is Spruce Fir Forest. This is your forest that occurs in the northern part of the state, mostly Coos County. High elevations in the White Mountains, high elevations in the western part of the state, all the way down to like the big peaks like Monadnock and Sunapee, and scattered around in little pockets of bogs and things like that that could be found almost anywhere in the state. Each of these habitat slides is going to have a little list of species at the top. These are directly from the Wildlife Action Plan. If you see a species highlighted in red, it means it's listed as threatened or endangered in the state. And then a few other species that are probably more common, people might be more familiar with in that habitat. Little pie chart showing the situation, and then some line graphs, usually taken from the Breeding Bird Survey, showing some examples of population trends. So for Spruce Fir Forest, we've got these birds, they all like conifers. The actually good news here is that roughly half of them are doing well, a third are declining, and the whole bunch we don't know. These are things like Canada jay, spruce grouse that are very secretive and very low density, so it's really hard to get data on them. And probably the most unfortunate thing on this graph is that black line for purple finch. Purple finch has been declining significantly for 50 years, from an average of perhaps 8 per root, that's what that number roughly is, down to only 2. So over the last 50 years, we've lost 75% of the purple finches in the state, and we don't know why. That's part of the game. Meanwhile, northern parallels are increasing. Winter wrens are bouncing around a lot. So what's going on with these habitats? Some of the major threats to Spruce Fir Forest are going to be related to forest management in many cases. Back during the heyday of forest harvesting in the north, we clear-cut large swaths of spruce and fir, and that was replaced oftentimes by hardwoods. So maple and beech moved in because the conditions weren't suitable for rapid regeneration of conifers. So we've converted a lot of conifer forest to hardwood forest over the last 100 years. At the same time, we've lost the mature age classes of those habitats. So again, we don't have loss of the old trees that might be important for certain species like some woodpeckers. These being northern habitats, climate change, these are northern habitats adapted to colder climates. So as the climate's warm, these species may be less tolerant. The data on that are still kind of mixing matchy. Acid rain was a long-term problem to these habitats, as are some invasive insect pests like balsam muliadelgid and a few other species that have been moved in that'll actually take out some of these trees. So all those things are going to be affecting the species composition of these habitats. So the big actions that people think about doing for these habitats, other than sort of really broad-based things like mitigating climate change, are really going to be management oriented. How can we sort of encourage regeneration of conifers versus hardwoods in these habitats? And people are working on that, especially up north, where there's a lot of conservation land in this habitat type. There are a few other species that we need better data on. Colleagues of mine at Audubon and partners have been working on rusty blackbird data to understand why they're declining. For a lot of these species, there was a significant wedge of unknown that we need to get some better data on. So the bottom line for the conifer forest species is that a big threat is just the overall loss of habitat, replacement by other habitats, and things like that. Oh, sometimes this thing does not want to advance. We shift into the hardwood forest, mixed forest, that takes up most of the state. The good news here is that, 2/3 or so of the species here are increasing or stable. And that's probably a testament to the fact that we've actually reforested a lot of the state, in the last 50 to 100 years after agriculture moved out. And, you stop farming and you're going to get a hardwood forest within 20 years, and these species actually do quite well. Not all of them, obviously. Wood thrush in that graph is, even more of a significant decline than purple finch was. Scarlet tanagers, as pictured here, are declining slowly, but other species are increasing. And it's important to kind of point out both of these last two graphs have kind of illustrated this, that even though you might have more species increasing than decreasing, in many cases, the decreases are way more dramatic than the increases. So with that, it does help explain that net loss, the 3 billion bird loss that was all over the news last fall. So these are your often very common forest birds, ovenbirds, vireos, lots of flycatchers, some of the raptors like broadwing hawks and barred owls. And by far the biggest threats to this habitat are going to be habitat loss and fragmentation and insect pests, the two that are bold-faced there. Right now, emerald ash borer is slowly spreading across the entire state. Hemlock woolly adelgid is doing the same thing. Gypsy moth comes and goes. And then habitat loss, the state is still growing in population. Our total forest is actually lower now than it was probably 20 years ago when I was doing my dissertation research. And it gets fragmented. So putting a road or a subdivision through otherwise intact forest makes that forest smaller, both in actuality and functionally. The bigger the edge, the less likely some forest interior species will use those kind of habitats. And we'll touch base on some of that again when we talk about conservation actions farther down. But the big one is there just to make sure we get big forest blocks. That includes strategies such as strategic development planning, so that rather than 500 cul-de-sacs, you put all your houses in one spot and set aside a big chunk of forest that's not going to get further fragmentation. And we definitely still need to know more about what the effects of some of these forest pests are going to be on this type of habitat. As I said before, if you cut down a forest, it grows back fairly quickly, and the intermediate stage there are what we call shrublands. These can include natural shrublands like pine barrens. They can include early successional forests after you've done a harvest, and they include sort of maintained shrublands such as you might find under a power line corridor or in an old field that used to be agriculture that's just having trouble returning to forest. And in stark contrast to the previous habitat, this is where the red outdoes the green. 2/3 or so of these species are declining. In that graph, things like the towhee, have gone so rare that some places you just can't even find them anymore on breeding bird survey routes. Just aside of warblers declining less so, and relatively few species are increasing. And the big threats here, in addition to development, which happens everywhere, is forest maturation. If you do not maintain a shrubland, with a few exceptions, it does not stay a shrubland. So if you don't, set fire to a pine barrens, it's going to turn into a forest and be less suitable for towhees and prairie warblers and those sorts of species. If you don't mow the power lines, they'll grow in the forest, and not only will you lose power, but you'll also lose towhees and field sparrows and thrashers and things like that. So these are species that are often called conservation dependent or management dependent species, that if we don't actively keep trees from growing there, these species will have fewer and fewer places to go. And there's a bit of controversy there, because in many cases, these habitats were relatively rare historically. There weren't large power lines crisscrossing the strait. Native Americans would be making little plots here and there. Most of these species were in lower densities, moved around the landscape depending on where an ice storm or tornado or hurricane or something hit, and probably occurred in low densities. So they might be actually more common now than they were 150 years ago, but right now they're declining, in often cases declining over large portions of their range. So we have to keep in mind that, this is something that we have to worry about in larger areas than just New Hampshire. And if you thought shrublands were bad, grasslands are probably even worse. Here we go, 3/4 of these species are in decline. It's a whole bunch of red bold-faced birds there, though they're all threatened or endangered. We've just added a couple of them in the last few years. Meadowlark and cliff swallow didn't used to be considered threatened, and now they are. I think the only species that we consider a grassland bird that's increasing to any significant extent is bluebird, which is not an obligate grassland bird. And the big issue here, of course, is the same as it was with grassland, and that is habitat maturation. All the big farms that used to be here are slowly growing up, and the ones that are here are much more intensively managed for agriculture, whether it's hay or, you know, if it's a cornfield, it's not even really a grassland. So hay is the main habitat. Hay fields and airports are the main habitats for these species, with a few reclaimed landfills and things like that. And of course, if you're haying a field, you need to mow it to get good hay, and that can actually kill grassland bird nests, make them exposed to predators and so forth. So the big issue for dealing with mowing, and of course airports mow to make the runways safe for aviation. So mowing is the big issue here, as long as the air grassland maintains a grassland. And you know, what we try to do, both federal and state partners, and sometimes Audubon, is figure out ways to get agreements with large grasslands to minimize that risk. So the Concord Airport, for example, because there's also cardinal blue butterflies there, they actually don't mow that as regularly, except in the immediate safety areas, and that maintains habitat for grasshopper sparrows or larks as well. And there are ways that farmers can get programs through the Natural Resource Conservation Service to actually do the same thing, delay mowing and get compensated for that loss of potential income from not getting more than 2 or 3 harvests in. And there are lots of little grasslands all over the state, and we can't keep all of them. And so what we tend to think about at the state level is which are the big grasslands, which ones support the most species. So the smaller fields, you know, in random locations across the state that probably have boblinks in them are not going to be as highly prioritized necessarily as larger airfields and large hay fields with multiple species in high density. Very small group of species occur in rocky and alpine habitats. In fact, this lists all of them. Nighthawk, falcon, pipit, turkey vulture, raven, and junco all occur in alpine or sort of rocky, talus, ledgy areas. So as a sort of catch-all group, I'm not going to spend much time with it. In some cases, they're probably susceptible to disturbance and habitat loss. You know, nighthawks used to nest on roofs, they no longer do. That might be because of things we did to do the roofs. Peregrine falcons obviously were historically affected by DDT. So this is kind of a catch-all group that we're not going to spend any more time on. So here's the flip side from the grassland. It's a small group of species that like large lakes and rivers. They're mostly doing quite well. You know, classic examples here, common loon and bald eagle that are sort of, you know, doing really well. You know, Chris Martin at Audubon just found a new eagle nest today, literally, in Laconia. You can see that graph there where eagle numbers are basically doubling every 5 years. At the same time as bank swallow numbers are declining really dramatically. We'll talk more about bank swallows in a separate section. And this habitat group is a little bit of a mishmash like the former one, but obviously lakes and rivers are subject to a lot of human use, whether it's by boaters or beachgoers or people wanting to build nice houses on the shoreline. All of those can affect the species that nest on those or use those habitats, as do anything that happens to the water. Many of these species are birds that feed on fish or otherwise get things out of the water. So if there's any contaminants and things like that, that can affect them. You know, the fact that those are lower is probably behind a lot of the increases in things like loons and eagles and ospreys and mergansers. So the big issue here is really to try to keep the habitat from being disturbed or developed. And in the special case of loons, minimize the use of lead fishing tackle, which is actually now illegal to sell in the state and a few other places in the country. At the edges of the wetlands, I mean, the lakes and rivers are marsh and shrub wetlands. These are your classic, you know, marshes and stuff where you've got things like rails and waterfowl and bitterns. And many of these species are very hard to find in this census, so you get a fairly large yellow wedge. And some of the more charismatic things like bitterns are slowly declining, as the graph shows. Some of the widespread, ubiquitous things like mallards and Canada geese are taking over the world. Not always a good thing. Ask a golf course or anybody about the Canada goose invasion. It's a conservation success story that's really overstated its welcome. So the actual birds that live in marshes that are obligate are often much less happy than geese and mallards are. And we don't often have good data on what the threats are. We know that if you fill in a wetland, it's not going to be good for birds. If you alter the hydrology with a poor culvert, that could result in the marsh becoming less marshy. Either it becomes a pond or it becomes drained, and that's going to mean birds have to go somewhere else. Beavers have been doing that for millennia, so it's part of the natural cycle of wetlands. But if we do too much of it, then it does result in wetland degradation on a larger scale that birds might not be able to handle. Invasive species are quite common in our wetlands, whether it's purple loosestrife or Phragmites, a lot of aquatic plants that are less obvious like milfoil. And the effects of those on some birds are not 100% clear. A couple of our rarest species like least bittern, the two sites for them both are full of Phragmites and the birds seem to be doing just fine, but maybe other species don't. So key things here are just protecting those habitats, maintaining wetland buffers, standard conservation issues. And we really still need better data on what the size and trends for these species are. Pied-billed grebe, for example, is listed as endangered in the state, and we know there's a handful of consistent places, but there's probably more that we don't know about because they're so scarce. And knowing where they are is the first step towards doing conservation for them. Moving on to another set of mixed habitats on the coast. This includes salt marshes, beaches and dunes, and coastal rocky islands like the Isles of Shoals, each of which has a slightly different set of species, all of which are highly impacted potentially by human activity because this is a very popular part of the state. It's very small amounts of habitat as the state goes. Maybe half the species here are actually doing pretty well. Common tern on the graph is a classic example. Fish and Game and Audubon did the tern project starting in the mid-90s and restored common terns to the tune of 2,500 plus or minus pairs at the Isles of Shoals, going from zero in 1995 or so when that project started. Meanwhile, things like the salt marsh sparrow here over on the left is, some people predict that may be extinct by the end of the century based on some of the threats that they face. The big threat to coastal habitats is obviously going to be sea level rise. Some projections from climate change suggest sea level could go up to a meter or more in the next 80 to 100 years, which would convert the salt marsh you see here in Seabrook into a big flat open bay, which would not provide any habitat for species like salt marsh sparrows and willets. Even the mud flats would be compromised for migrating shorebirds and things like that. Some of these species, especially those on the beaches, like piping plovers, predation and human disturbance are also very, very important. Anybody who's been to Hampton Beach in the summer would notice that there's a few people there. And that's the only place where we have piping plovers and least terns nesting. And we do what we can to minimize disturbance and predation, but it's a constant battle. The final habitat here is sort of another mishmash, but it kind of brings it back to your average New Hampshire person that might live in one of the small towns or one of our cities. There's a bunch of birds that live right where people are, in urban and suburban areas. And of those almost 60 species, it's slightly more increasing than decreasing, which is great. Things like cardinals didn't even used to be in the state until the early 1960s. Same thing with mockingbirds and titmice and house finches. Several species, that adapt quite well to human landscapes are doing quite well. A fewer species are declining. On the graph, house sparrows declining, which probably is not a big deal because they're not native, they're invasive. They actually are bad for other birds. But if something that's not native and invasive is declining, it might just be something to keep an eye on. Like, why are house sparrows, why are starlings declining? Is that a canary in the coal mine, as it were, that we need to keep an eye on? So even though they're not native and we don't really want them here, their decline might be something to keep an eye on. Not a lot of information on developed areas. You know, the things that happen there are going to be obviously predation. We'll get the cats later. Invasive species may be an issue in terms of a lot of the shrubs people plant, like barberry, most of which are no longer allowed to be sold in the state. Often have less quality fruit for birds and things like that. Development, of course, makes urban habitats even less beautiful, less useful birds, depending how dense the urbanization is. So that's the habitat section. I'm gonna take a quick drink here because I'm getting thirsty. We also broke categories into these 5 sort of ecological categories that aren't as much based on habitat. You know, waterfowl, pretty obvious categories, you know, ducks and geese. Shorebirds are sandpipers and plovers. Ocean birds, seabirds, that's a very large group, including terns and eiders and a lot of wintering species. Birds of prey, hawks and owls. And aerial insectivores are swallows and flycatchers. And we'll talk about each of these a little bit more just because they have different, by slicing the bird numbers in different ways, you can look at how different threats might impact things differently, because habitat's one thing, but what they eat is possibly another one, or where they live, in this case, waterfowl. Waterfowl are by far the success story of conservation in the 20th century. You know, we're in the 21st century now, but the waterfowl conservation started in the 20th century, largely due to hunters wanting to conserve wetlands, conserve their bird populations, due to indiscriminate hunting. Since the early 1900s, lots and lots of work has been done to restore some of these birds' populations, and they're doing quite well in the vast majority of cases. Some cases, there's probably a few threats, but not very well understood. But, you know, habitat loss was by far the biggest one. Because many of these species are hunted, they're very carefully monitored, and, you know, people adjust hunting seasons to minimize excessive take on species that might be declining, and it happens fairly constantly. You know, probably the biggest thing you can do is deal with keeping those wetlands intact so that birds have a place to feed and rest and forage during migration and for breeding. Shorebirds, on the other hand, are in the red. Most of these species breed up in the high Arctic in Canada, or at least in parts of northern Canada in the taiga, and winter in the Caribbean or Central or South America. They're some of the longest migratory birds we've got. And most of them don't nest anywhere near here, but this is a part of their migration route. So these birds will stop here in the spring and especially in the fall. They're already on their way south now. And when they need to stop, they need to feed. And what they're doing when they're stopping to feed is building up their weight, so they have a ton of fat, so they can take the next big leg of migration. Some of these birds will leave southern New England in the fall and fly nonstop to the Caribbean. And to do that, they need a large reservoir of fat reserves to fuel that flight. And anything that interrupts that could make them less likely to survive that flight. So things like human disturbance, people walking their dogs unleashed on beaches, driving on beaches, you know, any sort of thing that just, we see a bunch of shorebirds sitting on the beach resting. They're resting because they're saving up energy to fly a couple of thousand miles. So anything that puts them into the air makes them waste energy. They need to spend more time feeding, or if they leave when they're subprime condition, they might not make it. Climate change is also big for these birds because it could inundate with sea level rise both their breeding and migratory areas. You know, the tundra is thawing, and that might make breeding far more complicated up there. For the few species that breed here, piping plovers, for example, protecting nesting areas is important, and we're really trying to figure out best ways of minimizing disturbance during migration, but that's a pretty thorny issue. Seabirds, a very large mixed group. Most of these birds do not actually nest in New Hampshire. There's a lot of southern hemisphere birds like shearwaters and storm petrels that come up in their winter, which is our summer. So you go on a whale watch anytime from now till September, you'll see them up here. They're spending the winter up here because it's cold in the South Atlantic. And meanwhile, we've got things like terns and eiders and cormorants nesting on the Isles of Shoals during the summer. So these birds are all affected by different things. The one thing that unites them is that they live off of the ocean. And so some of the major threats here probably are going to relate to things happening to the ocean, including overfishing and, you know, harvesting of different species of fish that we've already taken out the good ones, we're taking smaller ones, which reduces the availability of some of these fish to the birds. Pollution is big, you know, plastics in the ocean, oil spills in the ocean, all of those can potentially impact these birds. And climate change is known to have an effect as it shifts the ocean temperatures, changes the food chains, and makes different species more prevalent than they used to be, which can filter all the way up to what puffins, for example, can feed their young. You know, the different species of fish are less suitable. Some of the southern species are less suitable prey for baby puffins than the northern ones, and both terns and puffins are sometimes having population crashes as a result of warmer summers with fewer fish that they can feed their young. So things we tend to do, we protect nesting places, obviously. We try to mitigate pollution, and climate change remains a large problem that we need to just act on a much larger scale than the state of New Hampshire. Success story are the birds of prey, largely because many of the threats to this group were related to DDT and persecution. And once we stopped, you know, poisoning and shooting some of these birds, they've recovered quite nicely, you know, as per my eagle graph before. Peregrine falcons, you know, also increased quite nicely, although they're still listed in the state. You know, osprey, another great example. A few species are declining rapidly. Kestrel is one of those. We don't really know why kestrels are declining. It might be because of insect populations. It might be because of habitat loss. But kestrels are actually declining more rapidly than, you know, probably every other raptor that's out there. And last but not least in this group, or my personal soapbox, are the birds we call aerial insectivores. These are the swallows, the swifts, the flycatchers, and the nightjars like whippoorwills and nighthawks. And as the pie chart shows, they are not doing well. Some of them are declining, you know, like we saw the bank swallow, barn swallow, chimney swift. Most species are declining fairly rapidly. And we really don't know why. Some of the speculation has to do with pesticides. These species eat insects, flying insects. And if we have fewer flying insects, which is a possible thing, there's lots of data out now about declining insect populations as well. So if there's fewer food, they might not be able to provide food for their young. Climate change can affect spring weather, which affects insect populations and in turn affects these birds. The most rapidly declining species in this group spend the winter in South America, so they're very long distance migrants, and things that happen in the winter grounds, as we'll talk about shortly, can affect them significantly as well. House sparrows actually are a problem for purple martins and cliff swallows in the state. So key things we can do at least nearby here are going to be reducing pesticide use, you know, not disturbing birds. If you've got swallows nesting in your barn, leave them be. They're not really hurting anything. And if there's colonial things, purple martins, classic example, we've actually got volunteers that are actually carefully watching all of our purple martin colonies to make sure that they don't get invaded by house sparrows and things like that. We need a lot more information on why these things are declining because we don't have a really good feel for it yet. So yes, I mentioned migratory strategy, and here's not all these graphs, and you can see from this that the farther you migrate, the higher percentage of your species are declining. So species that don't migrate at all, chickadees, woodpeckers, ravens, crows, are mostly increasing or stable. Short distance migrants, which winter within the US, are at least half increasing or stable. Mid distance, Central America, Caribbean, is 50-50, and when you get to South America, you know, more than half of the species that go all the way to South America are declining. So there's a pretty clear, you know, maybe not correlation, but relationship between how far you migrate and whether you're increasing or not decreasing. And a lot of the think theory here is that the farther you go, the more stress you're under, the more different habitats you have to go through, the more likely you're to run into crazy weather or changes in stopover habitat. And so the stresses you face by flying, for example, from Arctic Canada to southern South America are way bigger than from flying from, say, northern New Hampshire to Connecticut. And so the farther you go, the risks get compounded, and it makes a lot of sense that longer distance migrants are going to be declining more rapidly. For this most recent report, we actually analyzed data for some of the non-breeding species that occur regularly that have data. And that pie chart doesn't really say much other than that it's evenly split among those three broad categories: a bunch of declining, a bunch of stable, a bunch unknown. And because they're a huge mix of species, we're not really able to say what the smoking gun is for any single one of them. You can sort of refer them back to those habitat groups and say, okay, well, Arctic breeding shorebirds are probably more impacted by climate change in the Arctic or whatnot. But the fact it's very important for anybody to think about that birds that don't nest here are equally at risk from human activity, whether it's here, where they breed, or where they spend the winter. And the poster child of that is this guy, the Big Nose Thrush, which breeds only on the map there, only in those little yellow areas in New York and eastern Canada, and winters only in the Greater Antilles. And it's a species of high conservation concern because it's endemic to the Northeast. And people in the Northeast have done a lot of work protecting high elevation habitat, fighting wind facilities in Maine, regulating ski area expansion here and there, protecting huge areas of habitat. But when those birds leave New Hampshire in the fall, they fly to the Dominican Republic or Haiti, where we have far fewer of those protections. And people may recognize Haiti as being one of the poorest countries on the planet. Both of those countries have almost no forest left, and the forest that remains is highly at risk through, not indigenous people, but local people, poor people that are trying to eke out a living by agriculture or charcoal making and things like that. So we can conserve all the Big Nose Thrush habitat we want in New Hampshire, but if we also don't work with partners and local communities in the southern part of their winter range, it doesn't really matter. So it's kind of like what stays in Vegas, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. Well, what happens in Hampshire, what happens in the Dominican Republic doesn't stay in the Dominican Republic. It affects what happens in here in New Hampshire. So for any bird that migrates, it's very, very important to remember that they're not here for most of their lives, and we need to work on what happens both where they winter and where they migrate through. And that's especially true for shorebirds and things that winter in Latin America, where totally different sets of threats and totally different economic conditions are going on that we need to keep in mind. So I always used to say, to save Big Nose Thrush, buy land in the Dominican Republic. Few other threats that I've mentioned here and there. I'll just sort of summarize them fairly briefly here. We talked about most of these in terms of pollution. Plastics are a rising issue. And birds will ingest plastic. It affects both their mortality and sometimes reproductive success. Pesticides can affect food supply, can kill birds directly. Acid deposition, acid rain is way less of a problem than it used to be, but it still potentially has impacts at high elevations. And then, of course, things like direct contaminants, whether they're flame retardants, the PFASs that we're talking about now, or DDT in the past, that can actually also have similar effects to birds. The biggie that I want to spend a bit more time on is this one. In the last 10 years or so, some researchers have done a lot of analysis of mortality rates from all these man-made sources: cats, buildings, cars, power lines, towers, and turbines. And this is the result that, depending on your average, this is the average number, roughly 2 to 2.5 billion birds a year are killed by cats. So if anybody on the audience has a cat that let it outside, please don't let it outside. It's going to be hard, I get sometimes, I don't want to go outside. But they do kill lots of birds. They kill even more small mammals and frogs. They're not a native predator, and they do cause a huge amount of impacts to native bird populations. Buildings are far smaller. There's things you can do to windows, turn off lights at night, make the windows less reflective. That also minimize bird strikes. Cars are a little harder, but by then it's a fairly minor thing. And you'll notice that things like communication towers and wind turbines are very, very tiny. Not to be ignored, but and there are ways of mitigating those far better than it is for cats and buildings. So our presence in the landscape, even if we don't trash the habitat, has major effects based on just the things we put out there that weren't there when birds evolved on this continent. I mentioned disturbance a few times as well. Here's a dog flushing shorebirds. Don't let that happen. Fish and Game and Fish and Wildlife Service created this little document on the right on a way of sort of figuring out how to make trails that people can use that also minimize the potential impacts to wildlife. It turns out just walking a dog or walking by yourself in a trail can disturb nesting birds to some degree. And there's ways of, just maybe not having quite as many trails in a trail system, just decommissioning some trails so that, the natural world that you're appreciating is not as impacted by your activity. And climate change, we've talked about climate change here and there. This is just to sum it up. Obviously there's going to be habitat shifts over time. They'll be very variable. We're going to see things like sea level rise, warming oceans I talked about. Extreme weather events can actually impact birds during migration. And this thing called phenological decoupling really relates to, birds arriving later or earlier than their peak food supply because their cues are different. And, we're seeing some evidence of that with birds, both in Europe and North America, where birds arrive late, the insects have started early, and by the time the birds get here, the insect peak is not lined up with when the peak needs for feeding their young is. And that's something that, sometimes birds adapt, some don't. It's a complicated story, but lots of things going on there to complicate things. So to wrap it up, I believe this is the second to last slide. A few key conservation actions. If you had to do like one or two things, this is the list to pick from. Keep your cat indoors. If you're just, this is things you can do at your home. Even if you live in downtown Manchester, keep your pets indoors. Don't put out poisons in the world. Support local things. If you have to buy coffee, which can't be local, it's not grown around here, there's a whole certification program for coffee grown under better habitat for birds, that actually gets certified by the Smithsonian. Some of you can help collect data, volunteer to do bird surveys for Audubon, submit data to eBird. All those things are useful in the long term to understand what's going on in their populations. Treat your windows, do something to your windows, put a screen on the outside, do things to minimize bird strikes. Just by watching this, you're probably already keyed into maybe being a better advocate at the local or state level for conservation efforts. If you've got a bigger chunk of property, think about what's growing there. A friend of mine has stopped the mowing her lawn. It's got all these beautiful, it's like a little prairie out there. Any day now, she's probably going to develop some sandpipers in it. Not. But it's, it looks messy, but there's going to be seeds and flowers for pollinators and birds and everything else. If you've got a large chunk of habitat, like a forest, you can, think about how you manage that habitat to maintain different habitats for birds. And again, bigger building owners and things like that, minimize collisions. And if you're on a planning board or a conservation commission, think about, how you're conserving land and what you're doing with zoning even in a community, so sort of minimize some of these risks we've been talking about. I mentioned at the very beginning, cluster development. So you put all the houses in one spot, so each of them doesn't have a 20-acre yard. They all have a 3-acre yard, and there's another 100 acres off to the side that's been protected and not going to get fragmented in the future. And so to bring us back to that little graph we started with, there's our thing. We've got increasers, stables, decreasers, and unknowns, and there are 3 really broad strategies you can think about when we look at this graph. These are the guys we're doing well with. Let's not screw it up. Let's not all of a sudden say, oh my God, where did all the robins go? Because if robins start declining, we've probably done something wrong. We need to figure out what it was. There's a few species, marsh birds, northern birds, that we need some data still. We'll keep working on that. That's more of an academic and Audubon fishing game type of thing. And over here is where we can figure out ways to hopefully stop these declines. Maybe we can't reverse them, but if we can stabilize some species to keep them common, even if they're declined significantly, like towhees, then that's a step in the right direction. So keep common species common, we stabilize declines, and gather data are like the 3 big take-home messages from everything you probably heard, which was actually a fair bit. And at that point, I can let it open up for whatever kinds of questions have been showing up.
Thank you, Pam. Well, I kind of have one to get the conversation going. What are some of the impacts that bird feeders have on bird populations?
The famous bird feeder question. As far as we know, bird feeders are neither good nor bad. Birds, will come to feeders. We enjoy birds at feeders. And if anything else, they're a great way of engaging people with birds. Birds, there is no data that birds become dependent on bird feeders. So people often ask Audubon, well, what happens if I go away for a couple weeks in winter? My bird feeder won't be there. The birds will all die. Nope, they won't. They've been living in New Hampshire for far longer than we've been putting sunflower seeds out, and they will find food in the woods. They will find another feeder. There's no data that birds are dependent. If anything, sometimes it can be harmful. People sometimes have disease outbreaks at feeders, in which case you have to take your feeders in, disinfect them, and let it sit for a while. And then, of course, there's the whole bear issue, right? If you're going to have bears destroying your feeders, it doesn't benefit anybody except, I guess, bird feeder manufacturers. So bird feeding doesn't really fit in here at all. Bird feeding is just an excellent way to engage people with birds, and it doesn't seem to have any negative or positive effects on birds.
Awesome. Thank you, Pam. I have one from Gail. What has been the biggest change with species and habitat since the last State of the Birds?
The big thing there is probably the biggest change is probably not exactly what Gail is asking. It probably has more to do with just getting more data. So we've got that yellow wedge is a lot smaller. The general patterns, there was a slide way back at the very beginning. Just the Gail, I think I saw. This particular picture here, we've got increases in all these different categories because I don't think any habitat showed disproportionate change in the relative numbers of increasers and decreasers. I think it just basically gave us more data on things we knew and less data on things we didn't know.
This one is from Ken.
Oh, geez.
Are pesticides affecting non-pest insects disproportionately? An example, in an attempt to reduce mosquitoes, etc., are we hammering beneficial insects?
In many cases, we don't know. Depends on the pesticides. Most of the mosquito pesticides are very specific to Diptera, so flies, but they will also obviously take out other midges and non-harmful flies that are in those ecosystems, which obviously could affect entire food chains. So there was a guy I talked to a couple of years ago in Wisconsin doing a master's thesis on ponds that were not near to where they were doing agricultural spraying and seeing what the insect abundance was there. And most pesticides are often, depending on the pesticide, will be indiscriminate, which will take out other aquatic insects. And that's one reason the aerial insectivore thing is often suspecting pesticide use, because they feed a lot on aquatic insects that may be affected by whatever flows from farms into wetlands, but the jury is still out on that. Whether that fully answers this question or not, but
so I'll ask another one.
okay.
How would someone how would you create good habitat for migrating birds? What kinds of things would you want to put in your field?
You would want a nice mix of native seed and fruit-bearing shrubs in particular. A lot of the birds in the fall are going to be shifting over to, fruit. Things like even like eastern kingbirds will shift from eating insects all year to fruit in the winter. So as they migrate through, fruit is a quick and easy energy source full of, carbohydrates and sugars to help them fatten up quickly. So fruit is really important in the fall. Native fruits are great, seeds are great. And in fact, many of those same species also support good numbers of insects. So anybody who does a lot of birding, you go into the woods during migration, and there's a lot less activity there because all the activity for insects and fruit is going to be out in the edges or in the open areas. So if you've got a nice chunk of habitat and you want to grow things that birds might like, you definitely want nice weedy thickets and things like that, which may not look good in your neighbor's yard, but they'll be great for a stopover habitat for birds. Birches are good.
I got this one is forgive me, I'm not sure how to say your name, but it's what's up with the whippoorwills? They are great at a distance, but not when they sit on the roof.
Ah, yes, the famous whippoorwill question. not sure what what's up means. Whippoorwills actually have been declining, often quite significantly. Yes, I totally understand that they're very, very noisy when they're on your roof. But I know people that would, give a lot of money to hear a whippoorwill because they've disappeared from so much of their range. I'm not sure what you can do with them, other than earplugs or scare them off your roof. Maybe they wouldn't come back. But they're one of those early successional species that, has probably declined because there's fewer open, edgy forests than there used to be. Although in New Hampshire, right now, they seem to be doing pretty well.
Thank you. This one is from Alan. Anything specific property owners can do to help out cliff or bank swallows?
Bank swallows, I'll start with bank swallows. Bank swallows only nest in banks along rivers, so the big sandbanks you see along the larger rivers, or in gravel pit sandbanks that have been excavated for people. So usually, if the property owner is going to be either against the river or owner of a sand pit people, ideally, if they really want to help out birds, can identify where bank swallows are nesting and not excavate that particular piece of the bank during the breeding season. Same would apply to if you have habitat along the river. The problem with the rivers, of course, is that the river slowly erodes those banks, which is why they're there. And if you're the farmer that has that bank, you might lose farm every year to the river. And in which case, people will try to shore up that bank, which eliminates the habitat for the birds, which is not ideal. Cliff swallows, on the other hand, I know for a fact that Alan used to have cliff swallows nesting where he works. Don't think they're there anymore, but cliff swallows are very scarce in the state. There's about 25 colonies, mostly in the north and the lakes region. And if you have cliff swallows in your property, the best thing to do is not knock the nest off the house. They nest these gourd nests that are built out of mud on the eaves of a building, and they can be quite messy with mud and poop. But the thing to do is to not discourage them. If you do have a place that used to have cliff swallows and doesn't, colleague and I she's been doing all the work, I keep thinking about it, has started making artificial cliff swallow nests you can put up and potentially encourage birds to return to historic sites. So I should talk to Alan about that later.
Gail has one. It says, are any studies being conducted to determine cause of purple finches declining in New Hampshire?
Easy answer, no. And that decline is actually across most of their range, so it includes Maine into Canada and New York. There are so many species of birds and so few people doing research, and so if anybody out there is listening and wants to get a simple PhD project underway, a 20-year study on purple finch mortality would be excellent. But some of the theories that float around for them is going to be related to habitat loss and or climate change type things in the northern forest.
Thank you, Pam. I have another one from Ken. Are invasive fruiting plants less nutritionally beneficial to migrant birds than native plants?
Maybe. Some species are, some are not. In general, the wisdom used to be that they were in general not, but there's some more data that I've recently seen, I can't remember the details, that some of the invasives are not as bad as we thought. Some of them, things like honeysuckle are, often considered like just little sugar bombs. So might as well go eat a bunch of little Jolly Ranchers or something with have limited nutritional value, but at the same time, a little pulse of sugar certainly can help, with energy needs for short-term things. So it's a complicated question, but in general, the answer has been that they're not as good. But that begs the question of, so the birds that eat them in Europe and Asia, are they just in bad shape? Which doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. So it's a very complicated question without an easy answer. Answered everything.
Oh, I got a new one.
Oh,
this
excellent.
one's from Alan. How are the hummingbird populations doing?
Hummingbird populations are actually increasing. Not like through the roof, but that's one of the species that, you know, the data just keep showing that they're doing okay.
And what's your favorite bird?
That wasn't there. You just made that one up. I don't have a favorite bird. That's like, who's your favorite kid?
This one is from Lori. Is there any resource you might recommend to help identify birds that we hear but can't see?
There's a couple. The Cornell Lab of Ornithology has a really cool app called BirdNet that allows you to record a bird song on your cell phone and then play it back and compare it to an archive at Cornell and identify the species. It's really amazing. A friend of mine just uses it a lot. She knows her bird songs, but it's just fun to do it. She just points her phone at this noise and we hear it and she plays it back and it says, we think that's a robin. So that's a very fun way to do it. What I always recommend before BirdNet came on board is that if you hear a bird you don't know what it is, just chill and try to see it. And the act of searching very intently for an unknown sound both fixes the sound in your head, and then when you finally see it, you get that visual link and said, aha, that was a rose-breasted grosbeak the entire time. And next time you hear one, you're a little better off. There's also sort of online quizzes and all sorts of things like that.
So kind of going off Lori's question, how do you think the Merlin app would be for helping identify?
I think it works pretty well. I think there's always going to be issues. Again, the same friend of mine used to use it a lot when she was learning birds. And it's a great little resource, and it's probably just going to get better. And if people who don't know about it, you can just put in a little bit of information about where you are and what kind of things, how big the bird is, and whatever little bits of information you might have seen on it. And it'll toss out a bunch of options that you then can compare photos with what you saw and say, oh yeah, no, you know, was it a flicker or was it a robin? Well, duh, I can tell the difference between those. Uh-oh, Mark's here.
So this one's from Mark. How did you first get interested in studying birds, and how would you suggest inspiring the next generation of bird watchers?
So Mark probably missed your introduction because that explained the first one. I've always liked critters, and then I got into birds when I was 12 at a bird refuge where there were literally thousands of snow geese flying around, and it was pretty cool. So that's 45 years ago now. So now I know how old I am. So yeah, I got into birds because they were flying around and inspiring people. I guess the simple answer is you just have to get out there and look at the things, because how can they not be inspiring? You know, just get out and watch a bird fly. Probably a sort of fuzzy answer, but oh, there's Ken. Yeah, that's clearly, I can see the questions now, by the way. So Ken asked, explaining the southward expansion of merlins, palm warblers, and fox sparrows. So I love tossing those species examples out when people talk about climate change and birds moving north, because they're northern species that don't like the warm weather. Here we have 3 northern species, merlin, which is a little falcon, and palm warbler and fox sparrow, that until 15, 20 years ago didn't nest anywhere in New England or New York, but are now all over the damn place. And the reason I've got ideas, but the short answer is that birds do what they want to do rather than what we think they want to do. And the explanation for fox sparrow, at least, has traditionally been a lot of timber activity in Maine opened up lots of shrubby areas, and they moved into that, and then from there they jumped into other stuff. Merlins adapted to urban landscapes as well. Palm warblers, who knows, but they've exploded south. Someone asks how loons are doing in the Lakes region. Loons are doing okay generally everywhere. The population in the state, I'm not the expert on loons. You'd have to talk to the Loon Preservation Committee on that one. Loon populations are slowly increasing or stable. They do have highly variable reproductive success depending on weather and disturbance and things like that, but the exact data I don't know.
Linda McLean asks, we hear often about the negative impacts of global warming, and they are real. With regards to New Hampshire and birds and being very
parochial.
Thank you. Have there any benefits or positive changes to the New Hampshire bird population?
Probably. There's a lot of speculation that these southern species like cardinals, mockingbirds, Carolina wrens, titmice, which have been moving north through the state over the last 50, 60 years, have been benefited by that. They're species that are adapted to warmer climates, and Carolina wren in particular is a species that is still highly susceptible to cold. So, when I first moved to New Hampshire, Carolina wrens were almost non-existent in the late 80s and early 90s. And I, drove from Lebanon to Durham to see one. Now I've got them in my yard in Concord, and they've just increased significantly over the last 30 years. But if there's a really cold winter, the northern edge of that range will kill off a few of them because they just don't have high cold tolerance. So for species like that, we don't know exactly why they're all moving north, but climate change probably has something to do with it. And it may have other effects on other species that we haven't really figured out yet, So southern species moving north is certainly possibly connected to climate change.
Cindy asks, what is the source of the list of all New Hampshire species?
Good question. I've dug, I should have a link on this slideshow now that I think about it that shows the link. You can actually still download the original report, and once the new one is done, it'll be available. There is, through New Hampshire Audubon, there is a link through the New Hampshire Bird Records page of the official state list, which is everything, including all the really rare stuff, if that's what she means. So there's like 400 and something species, including the painted buntings and everything from painted buntings to cardinals. And that is, moderated by the New Hampshire Rare Birds Committee, which, votes on which species, we need to accept. As far as the list of common ones that this whole report's based on, that's more based on, personal knowledge. We know which species breed from things like the Breeding Bird Atlas and the Breeding Bird Survey, and things like eBird data that allow us to get a good feel for which species occur regularly. But if it's a hard and fast, does this species occur in New Hampshire, then the official state list is that thing I mentioned through the Rare Bird Committee, which you could probably dig around and find. We could maybe put some links up somewhere. You're welcome.
So I think we have time for a few more, if anyone has any last minute questions coming through. Is your report on this information going to be published soon? From Ken.
Yeah, I wish. I was hoping to have it published in March. We've got the bottleneck right now is the internal, communications staff, which is trying to juggle like 4 projects, such as a revised website layout for this, and dealing with content for our online education stuff. So ideally this fall, the text is written, the layout is started, and it's just a matter of finalizing those things and getting it to a printer. But I was aiming for March. It's now July, so maybe October. I won't make any promises, but hopefully the fall, this thing will be out and it'll get distributed online. Last time we sent copies to all the conservation commissions and stuff like that. So keep your fingers crossed, and we'll certainly let the world know when it's done. Lol donkey. It's like,
well, I'm not seeing many anymore.
Anymore until, yeah. Well, thanks everybody. Hopefully everybody got some good information out of that. There's a lot of stuff to digest, but apparently it's being recorded, so presumably that link will be made available somewhere, right, Christian?
Yeah, in a few days, or maybe tomorrow or the next, we'll have we'll have it all ready to go on YouTube. And then I believe we're posting it on our website as well.
Yep. And then like the blasts and stuff.
Yep.
Well, thank you, Suzanne. Fun to see some people names I know on that list. See you, Ken. See you, Ellen. I think Robert Valyards was listening at one point. So.
Well, thank you, Pam. Thanks
You're
for your
welcome.
work and all your expertise. I hope that everyone enjoyed learning more about the state of our birds. Next week we have Dr. Catherine York from Southern New Hampshire University joining us to talk about the New Hampshire bats and white nose syndrome. So stay tuned for that one if you'd like to join in as well.
Enjoy your birds, everybody.